friends, so today we have our monthly Q&A episode. We're going to talk about how much is too much cardio, if I take measurements, what my current macros are in my calorie deficit phase, how do you maintain muscle in body comp after you achieve a goal, and I think that's all. Let's get into it. But first, want to give you a heads up that Create Your Shape is open for enrollment right now. Create Your Shape is my nutrition coaching program where we accomplish three things. First, change your body composition, build muscle, and decrease body fat. The second is learn and understand the science and the strategy behind it so you can be empowered to make decisions and really understand the full framework and not just following one-off tips. The third thing is creating your nutrition routine that runs on autopilot. This is what makes it sustainable and doable to not only achieve the results you want, but maintain it or create compounding results year after year after year. Your physique should look like you lift weights. It should look like you work out because you do. And if not, it is just because you are missing the nutrition strategy on how that actually works. You're already putting in the effort. We just need to make sure the things you're doing are aligned to create the results that you want. So that's what we do in Create Your Shape. You can get signed up and join us right now at jennythenutritionist.com/create-your-shape. And enrollment ends on Monday, April 21st. So you want to get in there and get signed up now so you can get instructions to get started right away. All right, let's get into this Q&A episode. So the first question, do you take measurements? Meaning, do you get the tape measure out and do you wrap it around your arm, waist, glutes, all of that to see how things are, if you're losing or gaining, all of that? So yes and no. Yes, I have taken them before, but no, I don't typically take them frequently in my various phases. I do have my clients take measurements though. However, let me explain again. Everything's always comes down to context and all about education. So the reason being is because when you have more to gain or more to lose, you're going to see bigger changes. So having measurements is just another tool to represent that, and a different way to represent that. So that's why I think it can be beneficial. However, once you get to a certain size or a certain leanness, in combination with how big or small a human you are, it may be very difficult to have those micro changes be accurate. So for example, I'm just a really short person, so I'm generally petite. So just from an absolute standpoint or relative, I think absolute standpoint, it's just those measurements are going to be smaller. So then on top of that, if you're already lean, you're going to see very micro changes every time you do the measurements. And then on top of that, there's just a lot of room for error when you're measuring yourself, because literally I would be like, okay, I have in my notes, on the third freckle on my arm, that's where I would take the measurement. But if I'm off just a millimeter up or down, that's going to change it, right? When the changes are already going to be so small, it just doesn't feel very accurate. And then also when you consider taking measurements is just like the scale or other thing, it's just a one-time data point. So let's say I'm bloated that day and my belly is an inch bigger, right? Which I've had SIBO, so I have that happen sometimes, and that could totally throw things off too. So while I think it is definitely a tool, another tool that can be beneficial and use, especially if you have more to gain or more to lose, or if you're taller, then that might be beneficial. But as you get super lean, it may not be as accurate, which can be difficult to use. However, I still take measurements now and then. That's the answer there. All right, next up is, let me find it. Oh, what are your current macros in your calorie deficit? Okay, so if you guys have been following along, you know that I did a 6-month build phase, and now I am 2 weeks, not even 2 weeks into my calorie deficit phase. And I started off at 1,950 calories, which breaks down to roughly 130 grams of protein, 250 grams of carbs, and 50 grams of fat. So that was week 1. And then week 2, we made a few adjustments to my meal plan, so that shook things up just a little bit, but essentially just dropped carbs by 10. So it put me at 1,900 calories and same protein, 130 grams of protein, 240 grams of carbs, and 50 grams of fat. Now, I'm like rounding just because it's so much easier to speak to that and make sense of that versus being like 127, 48 grams, all of that. But that's generally it, and I'm sure I'll share a lot more about this, but just to give a little insight, this is a lot of food to be in a calorie deficit for sure. So I'm pumped I did that build. I'm pumped I built my intake so high. And will I stay at this high intake? I don't know how long. I imagine it will need to come down at least to 1,800, maybe 1,700. So we'll see. But so far, my body is responding well to that amount. All right, so that's my current macros. The next question, let me pull it up, around cardio. All right, how much is too much when trying to build, how much cardio is too much when trying to build muscle? I've always been a runner, usually do 3 miles a day after strength training, but I'm just not gaining much and wondering if I need to pull back on the cardio a bit. Okay, this is a good question. And this is something I coach my clients a lot on. It's something that I really had to work through. And essentially, the more goals you have and the more spread out your training intent is, the less impact you're going to make and the less progress you're going to make on those goals. So prioritizing one goal and doing everything for that one goal is going to be most effective. That could be a whole other episode because I understand wanting to but I also want to do this, but I also want to do this, but I also want to consider this. So that's just kind of like a concept. However, it doesn't mean running is going to completely take away from another goal. But this is my answer, and then I'm going to explain it. I would say 2 to maybe 3 days a week after a non-leg training day would be like optimal for cardio, or the most that you could do for cardio. Not optimal, but the most that you would do for cardio if you wanted to be a runner too. And your priority was building muscle and building legs. But it's going to look very different, like based on every individual. This would just be like for her and what she shared. But it all depends on like the formula. And this is what I mean behind that. So there are 2 things required to build muscle. 3 things. 3 things to required to build muscle. 1 is the stimulus. You got to have a stimulus that is saying like, hey, you got to lift more, so you need to build this muscle bigger and stronger. And that is lifting weights, lifting heavy enough weights. So assuming that's being done, like check. The next is nutrients available to build that muscle. So that's the second thing. The third thing is recovery of that muscle. So it actually has the time to respond to that stimulus and then be ready for the next session to continue to grow. So if you think those are the 3 things I need to build muscle, how would running or the additional cardio play a role, and how could it eventually negatively impact? Like, what's the threshold there? So too much running, meaning too much cardio in this scenario, could impact the second and third thing I just talked about. The second thing, which is nutrients available to build muscle. So this just comes down to the formula, meaning if you have running and cardio in your goal is to build muscle, you need to know how many calories you're burning per day with your training session, in with the cardio in, per week, to then make sure you're eating enough to have the nutrients available to build muscle. Kind of like if you are building a house, right? And you're like, ooh, I really want a 3rd bedroom in the house. and the workers are like, they've got a big pile of wood and they're building the third bedroom, and you're like, ooh, and I want to add on a shed. It's just like the third bedroom is your legs and you want to build muscle for them, and the shed is the cardio, right, in the running. The worker's going to be like, okay, well, we need enough material, we need enough of that pile of wood to be able to build the third bedroom and support the shelf or import the shed, right? So it really comes down to the formula of, are you eating enough? Are you getting enough calories to give your body enough to build that muscle and also support the running that you're doing? Which it can be done for sure, but you just want to consider that. All right, so that's the second thing. The third thing I have, or how it impacts number 2, which is recovery, right? Can the muscle recover enough to optimally go into the next training session? That really comes down to like enough nutrients, sleep, rest days, but also running is going to tax the lower body. It's going to tax that muscle. So this is why I would suggest running on non-leg days, so that way you have time to recover from those leg training sessions. And that's also why I would suggest for this person, because she's already a runner, so she probably 2 to 3 days is probably not something that's too taxing for her, and she's probably used to that. But that's why I would suggest bringing it down to only 2 to 3 days if the priority is building muscle and lower body muscle. So anything that is taxing the muscle that you want to grow that is not strength training, that is going to come at a cost to the development of that muscle. The question is, what's the threshold, right, that you can handle? And it's going to come down to all the things I just shared of like the formula and nutrients and recovery. In addition to that, she said that she wasn't seeing progress. So that's telling me that something I mentioned isn't checking out, and she probably needs to review it. In addition to reviewing like how many working sets are you doing for your lower body or the specific muscle that you want to grow per week, and increasing that, making sure that is like at least 8 to 10, maybe even higher if you're already doing that and not seeing the progress you'd like. Okay, next up, and the last question, she said, how do you maintain muscle and desired weight once you've hit that mark? Okay, so if you've hit your goal, it is so much easier to maintain your physique than it is to change your physique, which is great news. So think of it as 2 separate things, like you're building your amount of muscle and your body fat, like 2 separate goals, 2 separate things to maintain those. So for the muscle mass, to maintain that muscle mass, you want to do at least 60% of the intensity in training sessions. So let's say that you are doing like 2 sets per week of a going to failure of that muscle group. That likely might be enough to maintain that muscle that you have. This could be a whole episode too, but I'll move on to the next one, which is body fat. How do you maintain the body fat that you have? So then it comes down to, again, the formula of energy balance. So if you are burning 2,000 calories per day, well, as long as you eat under or at 2,000 calories per day, you're gonna maintain that body fat that you have and you won't add any body fat. However, if you're going above 2,000 calories per day and eating in a calorie surplus, then you're going to add body fat. Especially if you're consistently eating a surplus, then you'll consistently add that body fat over time. So this is what happens when people rebound or when they gain weight after a deficit, because they're not controlling that energy balance for their day-to-day for the long term. This could be a whole nother episode, which I might do soon, but at least this gives you the answer of how to maintain. It is so much easier to maintain, but you still have to acknowledge what it takes and what that actually looks like, and it all comes down to math and science. This is why I emphasize teaching so much in Create Your Shape, and for you to really understand not only this energy balance and the formula, but the actual strategy, the full strategy, not just from the science in why we do something in the overall framework, but how do you actually do that? Because you're not just a lab rat, you have a social life, you have careers, you have bad days, so you have taste buds. How do you balance all of that while considering and knowing the science in the formula? The science in the formula kind of just removes all of the confusion, so you're like, okay, yeah, now I know exactly what to do, what to expect. And then looking into like the skill of nutrition and executing nutrition and having a structure and having a routine that just runs on autopilot, that is where you take that knowledge and actually apply it and implement it so you can change your body composition, but then also maintain it for the long term. Or my favorite, what I do and what all my clients generally do is like, oh, now I know how it works. I'm seeing the changes. What else can I do? What's going to be my new goal? Like, it gets fun and it gets exciting. So if you're someone who is lifting weights and you're like, yes, this is what I need, I want to understand it, I want to change my body composition, then you got to join us in Create Your Shape. You can do so right now while enrollment is open at jennythenutritionist.com/create-your-shape, and I'll see you inside.